The Tragedy of Gotham Knights, a missed opportunity I so desperately want to forget. A game that looked to be something special, just to fall short of expectations. But is it all justified? If we're looking at it from a character design standpoint, I actually think Gotham Knights did a really good job focusing on making each character unique and making their character stand out in different ways. I've seen some people complain about Nightwing. Maybe some of the haircuts were a bit weird, but personally, overall, I didn't mind him too much. He wasn't my favorite. Batgirl, a lot of people like. I will say there's some kind of weird people out there that have some things to say about Batgirl that I'm not going to talk about. I think Jason Todd is a really good character model in this game. I think he maybe is a bit too big. I've seen some complaints that he looks like the Hulk. Yes, I think that's true. He maybe is a little too wide. But after the Lazarus, it said he is 6 foot, 225. That's a pretty big dude, if we're being completely honest. So I do think he should be a little bit bigger and broader than the rest of the Bat family, but they might have hulked him out a little too much. I think they also did a good job designing the suits in this game, from bringing in suits we already had, as well as designing some new ones. I think the design team doesn't get enough credit for the job they did on those. I think every character had specific suits that were better in each category. They made them so that each design of the suit, whether it was Shinobi or whatever the case is, matched the rest of the Gotham Knights, but also had their own unique design, which I really enjoyed. I also think they did a good job designing the villains fresh, especially someone like Harley. I think the older and more mature Harley is amazing. I think the prison outfit is awesome. A lot of people complain that Harley's black and red outfit wasn't that great. I mean, is there better? Probably, but you're never going to be perfect. But having a fresh and unique spin on it is where I think this game actually did a really good job to some of the predecessors. You may be the type of person that prefers more copy and paste comic book adaptations. Now, personally, that's not what I like when I'm thinking of new media. We have so many comics to go off of, and there's so many variations of the comics. I prefer when they don't get stuck between two different types and just go for what they want. And I feel like that was a bit of the problem with Gotham in general in this game. They got stuck between the comic book feel and more of a realism feel. I think if you want to go comic book, go for it. If you want to go realism, go for it. But don't sit in the middle. The hideout is also not enjoyable. I think it's because Gotham doesn't do a good job distinguishing itself from other media, which is kind of what I talked about a little bit earlier. I like when they don't copy and paste. I want them to go ahead and make this Gotham exactly how they want to make it. I've personally imagined Gotham as a more vertical, cramped city. I know a lot of people don't like the New York comparison, but that's really how I envisioned it, is how New York City is a lot of the time. I do think being after Batman's death, the clean and generic kind of comic booky look doesn't really feel right. They maybe should have went full on realism, made it dark as could be. I think it was just a strange design choice. They did such a good job focusing on character designs, villain designs, and then they just gave us a very conventional Gotham. The freeways kind of laid out the map to connect each sections, or the highways, whatever they're called, bridges, I don't know. But they didn't really give us any diversity that shows, okay, this is completely different than other Gothams, or better, actually. It's really not even just different, but it's better, because when we think about it, there's so many movies, other games, TV shows that all have Gotham in it. And this is just not the best one. And yeah, of course, maybe movies have an easier chance of putting specific types of Gothams or whatever the case is, because in games, you obviously have to be able to traverse it to play. Especially when they chose to give us maybe the worst way to get around the city with the Bat Cycle. I mean, they give us a speed effect to try to show us how fast we're going, but in reality, we're barely passing cars. It's actually quite ridiculous how slow we go through the city. I don't know if that's because they just couldn't fit more city, and the way they scaled the game, they had to slow us down so that we couldn't just fly through the city in seconds. I don't know, but I would drive for minutes without spotting anything. It was completely dead a lot of the time. There was no real movement. A lot of the cars would be stuck, or even like police wouldn't really move. Sometimes in crimes they would, but Gotham was really devoid of life in this game. They made sure to try and make it look lively from color scheming and the way each building had kind of like a colored cloud on it. But then you get down to the ground and there's just nothing going on. And especially on launch, Gotham Knights also had a ton of performance issues, and there was a lot of stutters, frame problems. They have fixed some of that. They're still locked at 30 FPS. Most players couldn't get even that on launch. Nowadays, I believe most players are probably fine with that. Now, I personally didn't come across a lot of these issues. I didn't have a stutter or a massive frame problem. I will say I am no expert in frame rates. So when I play a game, as long as it's not stuttering or looking completely horrible, I don't always notice buildings in the back maybe not loading in perfectly or not looking great unless I'm actually paying attention to that type of thing. I will say the user interface decisions in this game were extremely weird to follow and not simple to use. We'll go more in depth on that a bit later on, but I think that's something else they really should have focused on improving. It's unfortunate the open world is so dull. I really was expecting more from Gotham Knights. I think a big part of it is the fast travel system. I don't know why a lot of developers and games like making you do challenges to unlock fast travel. Now, I get fast travel being locked in the beginning of the game. It forces the player to traverse the world, learn some more mechanics, see what's out there. But I like the way a game like Assassin's Creed does it, where you climb up to a place, you synchronize, and that unlocks the fast travel. I think more games need to focus on that instead of something like Gotham Knights forcing us to do these weird drone challenges that are just really boring. I will give Gotham Knights credit though on how they chose to create less side content but have multiple part side missions based around specific villains. We know Clayface, Mr. Freeze, and Harley all had those. For me, the Harley Quinn portion was probably the most fun, especially the part in the prison. Now, I will say it sucks that that was early on. I think it kind of roped me in, and then throughout the game, it kind of got worse and worse to a certain extent. I think that specific mission, though, especially when we were chasing Harley through the courtyard and had the rock music playing, I thought that was really awesome. I'm definitely someone that prefers to have more activities that are focused around story, even in the side content, rather than fluffing up content and adding in pointless activities. Now, I will say Gotham Knights definitely had the fluff and the pointless activities as well. The normal crimes and other activities were definitely built around being able to farm gear for upgrades or farm materials for the gear to upgrade, which I think is a little annoying. I'm personally not a fan of farming in games. Now, there is some games where I am, like a MMO game, for instance, but when we're talking about single player games that are purely focused on a story and things like that, I don't think they need to have farms. I think contexts like The Watch are infinite challenges where you could speak to side characters like Penguin, Jada Tompkins, and then you stop some crimes, you earn high level armor. I think those in themselves are cool, but I would have liked for them not to be infinite and actually have maybe a limit. Like once you do each type of mission one time, it'll give you a reward for each one, high level gear or whatever the case is. There was also other collectibles like the Batarang retrievals, landmarks of Gotham City street art, and the Historia. Don't know how to say it, but there's whatever it is, Strigade, I guess. Those really are just for collectible purposes. I mean, they do give you cool stuff in terms of like maybe suits or whatever the case is, colorways, but you don't really need it unless you're going for platinum or you just want to have everything done. Now, the time travels and stop crimes for each character are forced to be able to be done to get the heroic travels. I wasn't really a fan of that. Once again, I don't think I should have to do these weird challenges. You'd have to, for instance, stop like 10 crimes or complete all the time trials, and that was for each character. So you'd have to go do all of Robin's to get his heroic travel, because that's how you became the heroic travel mode. And I think honestly, it wouldn't have been as bad if heroic travel was more fun to use, but they were all really trash in my personal opinion. I mean, literally all four of the heroic travels for the characters were slow to use and just boring overall. Robin basically uses a teleporter. Batgirl's was probably the best because she does use her cape to glide. It's probably the most like normal, I guess. Nightwing uses a Fortnite glider. If you know what Fortnite is or you've played Fortnite, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Red Hood uses a mystical super jump, which is also really annoying to use. It's just kind of silly. I don't know where he gets that super jump from. Never seen that before. You know, the thing is about the open world is it's drastically better with co-op, and it's very obvious they made it for co-op. And they did make it untethered, which means you and your friend can do your own thing. You're not forced to do the same exact content. So you can load into your friend's lobby and do different side content, and then you guys can join up for a main story mission or whatever the case is. The issue is not everyone has that friend to play with. I think that's a big problem that I personally have, is I didn't have anyone to play the game with, and playing with randoms is not the same. I know it's good that you still can join random lobbies, but it's really hit or miss. If you put your lobby on public, you can't necessarily invite people, but people could randomly join. I know that you could technically private it. I didn't know that at first. I wasn't really looking for it. And the same thing, if I would join other people, it wasn't like they were inviting me and saying, hey, I need help. Sometimes you would join people and they would just be standing in the belfry, not even playing. Maybe they didn't even want a player in there. So it was kind of annoying to have someone join when you weren't interested, because it would change how strong the enemies are. And if they weren't doing the content that you were doing, then the enemies were actually a lot harder, which is fun if you're playing with a friend. If you're playing with a random and you can't even hear them on the mic or anything, it's not as fun. It's unfortunate because the game really screamed live service and paywalls. It was obvious that that was their focus on the game, and then they realized that it wasn't going to work. So they overhauled it and they withdrew the paywalls, but it really wasn't enough to fix the systems already put into the game. The gear and crafting system is completely horrific. The idea of better gear in games like this are not the issue. I think some people will say there shouldn't be gear upgrades. I think that's good to have, but it's the idea of how you do it. It doesn't matter how many times I ended up reading the crafting system or how many times I looked it up. I still found myself confused, especially when you added in needing mod chips to upgrade the armor even more, and then also having all of these different types. And it was a bit confusing because you can get the basic hang of it to upgrade the items, but because of how much you had to farm the materials, you just sat there for hours farming to get the upgrades. And then after all of that, if you choose to go with a transmog, you're not able to customize it. So you were either stuck with gear that is too low of stats, or a style you didn't want, or just something that you didn't want, which is really confusing to have a very restrictive system for a game that's focused on customization. Like I said, unlock the transmogs and all of the different styles however you want in the game. Give us some basic upgrades through stats or whatever the case is throughout the game to put some of that system in, but don't restrict us. Let us choose what style we want. Don't make us farm too much, and you would have a lot better system. But when you put so many complications, which once again, this goes back to being a paywall game that was pretty obvious, I think that's just where the game didn't work. When you mix that with a slow combat system, it's just a recipe for disaster. The combat itself was very repetitive. You would hit enemies, dodge the attacks, and then save up for your special attacks or your abilities that you unlock. Every single one was a bit different. For me, Nightwing's combat was extremely unresponsive and slow. It was not how I expected Nightwing, the acrobat, to fight. I think he was the one that out of everybody was the most disappointing because I honestly expected him to be one of the most fun characters to use, and he was one of the worst. But overall, all four of them, the way we would make our way slowly towards enemies was really weird. It just didn't make sense. It was extremely clunky. We're talking about some really good hand to hand combat fighters. I mean, Robins in general, right? Like having multiple Robins and obviously Batgirl and everybody in the Bat family is really quick, agile for the most part. But instead, they were running around kind of robotic, not really smooth at all with the way they fought. I think it's because the combat in Gotham Knights is just not intuitive. At times, it could even be counterintuitive. There's times where you delay from when you click the attack button to when your character will attack. It's really not fluid at all. Sometimes the initial attacks feel like a power up. And look, I'm not like a Super Saiyan or something. Unless it's going to do some massive damage, I don't need to wind up. If I click attack and I'm trying to punch, it should be a quick punch. Even the combinations would have hitches in between certain attacks depending on which character and which combination you use, which was really weird. I think having four different characters made it harder for Warner Brothers Montreal to put more advanced movesets in the game because they had to start from the ground up on each individual moveset, and that was pretty obvious that each individual moveset was fairly different. They wanted each character to feel different and look different, but it made it so that each combo kind of ended up being the same. The characters' moves ended up feeling really shallow, and there wasn't a lot of disparity on combos or combat that you can do. I think having a second combat button or a second attack button would have been better than the range attacks, because honestly, the range attacks were not fairly useful. Obviously, maybe Red Hood's, that's a little bit different, but for most part, especially I played a lot of Robin, and his range attack, it was very inaccurate. Sometimes it wouldn't even lock onto the target. So it was hard to move between enemies, hit different enemies, use your range attacks. With Robin, I really had to focus on stealth and then hitting some abilities to do damage, which kind of ended up being a bit more boring than using more combos or more tactical strategies. Especially the range combat enemies in the game, they targeted you at really weird times. And just mechanically, it was really awkward the way I had to keep dodging until I felt an opening. It wasn't a tactical dodge though, it was more of a spam dodge, which was just a bit awkward and clunky and messed up combat's fluidness. I think the bright spot of combat for me definitely was stealth, which is probably why I liked Robin more than any other character. I know people have said I think Batgirl is also pretty good in stealth. I didn't try too much stealth with Batgirl. The game definitely focused on having stealth at least be taken into consideration. Some of the bonus objectives want you to do things covertly. Some of the missions in general, you more or less had to do them covertly or else they were really hard to complete. The issue with stealth I had is not really having a take cover or just an easy way to get behind items. Sometimes you would try to get behind an object, but depending on the object, you would bump into it a bit clumsy. I did get a little bit better as you get more used to the mechanics. It did become a little bit easier. The AI alertness is a bit wonky at times. Sometimes I thought I was in the clear and then every enemy sees you, and it's a bit annoying when you're doing something like organ recovery, for instance, because soon as they see you, you start a timer and all of a sudden it becomes almost impossible to complete the mission. Even in the bomb threat missions, they want you to take everyone out in stealth, but they make it really hard to do so. And it's not just a skill issue, but if you are playing on a higher difficulty, you physically can't take out the enemies in stealth, even with Robin, unless you 100% have like maxed out gear and mods and all of that different stuff. It becomes very hard to actually take out enemies in stealth. And I know some people, that's what they've said is I even on hard difficulty, I had maxed out gear, but I'm trying to play a stealth character. When you talk about a leveling system and health bars, it affects the ability to be in stealth late in the game. Someone like Robin should be able to take out just about anyone, maybe not like the really strong brute characters, but most of the normal henchmen should be able to be taken out with stealth pretty normally. I'm not sure what they would have needed to add to make that happen, whether it's just a setting, maybe there's an ability that you could have got early on. Maybe it's one of the first Robin stealth abilities you can unlock, which gives you those one-shot stealth takedowns. But it's a bit unfortunate as a stealth player to not be able to stealth anybody, because if you can't stealth take out one enemy, they all see you, and then just like that, the mission's over. And some people have said drop down the difficulty, and I'm just never been a fan of that. I don't think I should have to drop down a difficulty just to complete a specific mission in a specific style, because that doesn't allow the player to actually play the game how they want. And I really didn't want to just grind legendary suits to be able to do that. I didn't want to have to be forced to play a specific style to get the results I want. Guess that's just what happens when you force things like health bars onto enemies, now forcing players to have a high enough power level for stealth. Power level is something that I'm not really a fan of in these type of games. I think to a certain extent, having upgrades is good, but a lot of the RPG elements could have been avoided, especially I believe with the character roles. Every character should have their own unique abilities and skill trees, but a game that is primarily solo and possibly co-op, I don't think you need roles like support. A lot of people say Nightwing is more of the support. You have Red Hood, who's more of like the range bruiser. You have Robin, who's more of the stealth. You have like Batgirl, who's more like gadget or whatever the case is. And I don't think that's necessary for a game where I'm playing by myself a lot of it, or maybe co-op. A game like DC Universe Online, if you're familiar with that, had roles because it had PvP, PvE, and a lot of the raids or missions were 4-player or 8-player. When you would just go into a 2-player mission, if you're not familiar, most people would switch to their damage role and use damage abilities, because there was no reason necessarily to have someone that healed and someone that tanked when you were doing a duo. Most of the time you could just go 2 damages and it worked out better. I believe Gotham Knights would have been better built for purely damage dealing, with small adjustments per character in terms of the abilities and whatever the case is, because there was no need for like a quote unquote tank role or support role or anything like that in this game. I think strip back the RPG elements and let everyone do what they want to do most. Pick their favorite Bat family member and go crazy. The Bat family members just were not equal in a lot of ways, in my personal opinion. I think that caused a lot of problems because most of the RPG elements were pretty unnecessary, besides making the player grind for hours for the upgrades that took you away from the story and the immersion that the game was trying to build. I think it's a bit unfortunate because I think it takes away from what Gotham Knights story could have been and force some of the critique into the wrong areas because they lacked immersion in the game, which then made them feel like maybe the story was at play. I've seen a lot of people complain that Batman's not a playable character. I know a lot of people complain about that. They said from the start, this is not a Batman game. So if that's your complaint, I think it's not really fair because they never made it seem like Batman was going to be a main character to play in the game. They very much made it known that this was going to take place after Batman's death. Not every game needs to follow the same path. Although a lot of people want to play as Batman, which I understand, it is also very repetitive to have the same characters over and over again. I mean, we look at, for instance, movies. How many times have they reset like the Batman universe or made a new Gotham and a new Batman? And if they reset the whole universe different from the Arkham series, and then it had all of the same qualities of that, there would still be a lot of people complaining and really comparing it to the Arkham series and saying, well, this is supposed to be Arkham or this is supposed to be a continuation, but it's not. So really, there's no win-win. You're always going to have a bit of negative. I actually really enjoy the Court of Owl's story for Gotham Knights. I think it was a really good choice of main villain. I just feel like they wasted some good plot points and focused on the wrong plot points for the main story. The Secret Elite plotting from the shadows on paper is really exciting the way that is. It's a fairly new comic, so it hasn't been in too much media yet, especially, in shows or games, things like that. And I like having a new villain rather than If they would have put like Harley as the main villain, or even someone like Joker, that is very much known, has been in almost all Batman media. I think it's just unfortunate that they made the Court of Owls a bit like lamer. I don't know if that's a way to say it, but Court of Owls are supposed to be really like cool, and they kind of made them lame. They weren't even the ending boss fight, which I think was a big misstep. The way they had us get tossed aside for the League of Shadows and Talia was a bit unfortunate, especially because Court of Owls are supposed to be that main villain in this game. And I just think they're way more compelling than the League of Shadows in a lot of ways, especially with Batman being dead. I think the Court of Owls working from the shadows and the Knights trying to take them out and figure out who they are, maybe pushing into more of a global Court of Owls, and Gotham actually only being one entity of them could have set them up for more of a sequel, even, which I think would have been a great way to expand on the story. The extra side villains like Harley, Mr. Freeze, and Clayface are really well done, in my opinion. I think I've already talked about Harley and what I think about her and how good her character is. Mr. Freeze, I really enjoyed how they changed Gotham for his missions and how they made it into like Frozen and how you had to climb up the Frozen part. I think that was really cool. I think that was really unique. I like that the city was changing. I think Clayface looked really cool, but I do think they did miss a good opportunity with having 4 different characters for these story missions. They forced each character to have similar options. So basically the way they made it is you would go into, let's say, meet Harley, and there was 4 different dialogues depending on the character, and they were all supposed to be fairly similar and follow the rough same plot point depending on who you used. Instead of making each mission different, I think what they should have done, and what would have been a better option, is making specific missions for each character. Maybe one mission you go and you talk to Harley, and maybe that's a multiple character mission where the cutscenes will actually have 2 characters from the Knights, Gotham Knights in there. Maybe one is all 4 of them. Maybe one is just one of the 4. I think it could have been a better system to force you to play all 4 of the characters throughout the story, but also it could have been a little bit easier to make the story make sense. It doesn't make sense that 3 knights would always just hang back while one goes every single time, especially when you get to some of these more serious situations. I think it would allow for more plots to be answered and make more sense and unique conversations, because they would have only focused on one dialogue piece per mission or per story, whatever the case is, and it could have just been different characters and they could have wrote it a bit better. Instead, it seemed like a really weird copy and paste. A lot of the story just didn't make sense when the knights showed up. Imagine if the last fight was 4 players switch between characters. That could have been awesome. That honestly could have been one of the best fights ever in a game if done correctly, switching you between characters at different points or whatever the case is. Even co-op didn't make a lot of sense, because the way they did co-op is the story would only take the character into consideration that is the one that world you loaded into. So you can show up with Batgirl and Red Hood, for instance, but if Batgirl is kind of like the main character of that mission, the villain would be like, "Oh, Batgirl, you're here alone," and then you would load in and Red Hood's there. So it didn't really make a lot of sense. They should have made the story make sense for co-op, seeing that they planned this to be a co-op game. And especially from combat and role perspective, they focused on co-op, but the story, they made it singular. So it's kind of a little bit weird, I think. I think co-op purposes, having 2 knights there at all times would have been great. And then even if you had all 4 there, you still could have had the 2 playable ones and it would have made sense. I didn't play through too much as Jason because I didn't like his combat style, but I did watch his cutscenes, and I feel like Jason did have the most interesting dialogue options. I know a lot of people have said the game seemed to be more of a Jason Todd game, and then they chose to switch it to maybe co-op, or decided to go away from like the Arkham after story and go with all 4 knights. I could honestly see that, but I do think having 4 playable characters in knights creates more interesting dynamics if they would have done them correctly. I think if they would have took the story in the right direction, made the characters more likable, made the dialogue more likable, it could have been more enjoyable. I think the story got not only confusing but a bit boring, especially, I mean, spoiler, when Batman comes back to life and you have to fight him. That was just a little bit of a snooze fest. Like I said, I would have rather had like a Court of Owl boss towards the end. I know they're more of like the elite in the city. They're not necessarily fighters. They hire people to do that for them. But I think there could have been better ways to go about it than kind of recycling some characters and making some boring content. In a game with 4 playable characters and all of these RPG elements, you would have at least expected a proper endgame on launch, but that was also not the case. It took about a month for them to introduce Heroic Assault, which is a 4-player PvE mode, which once again reinforces the roles of combat, and it makes a little bit more sense in this style before. Like I stated before, it seems like something DC Universe did, or I would expect them to do. And honestly, DC Universe probably did it a lot better in a lot of ways. I mean, I played that game for years, so I have a lot of experience with it. But if you've already completed the main story within that first month, and then you were over leveled for the beginning of Heroic Assault, it just began to be way too easy. I was one-shotting all of the enemies. It was really boring. So to get to a challenging point to have fun, you had to grind through a lot of boring. And so it was just a little tough, especially because it wasn't released on launch. And as a solo player, I also found it hard to find like fun full lobbies that were the right skill level for the missions I was playing, because in the early missions I was over leveled. So I would join people and sometimes I would join only one other person, and then it would be too easy. I would go through it and then it'd be over. I think the thing is, Endgame is not necessary in that style for a single player solo game. I think that's where a misconception comes for a lot of these style of games, is what an endgame should look like. Like I said, this isn't an MMO repeatable game in the same way that something like a DC Universe is, or like a World of Warcraft or something, where people are constantly on the game grinding the content because people really can't outgrow the content until a certain point. This game is not supposed to be that. It's more of a one and done, played through as multiple characters, and I think they should have stuck to that script a little bit better. The thing is with Gotham Knights, even with all of those bad features, a lot of missteps, I still found it to be a pretty fun game. I enjoyed it. I even platinumed the game. Now, sure, they did miss a lot of opportunities to make it an all-time game in a lot of ways. I think it could have been one of the best games that we've played superhero-wise if they would have fixed a lot of the problems it has. So it is a bit of a tragedy that they went so far from what works and they ended up just missing the mark completely. But I do still believe you can find enjoyment in the game, even with being critical of what went wrong. I think a lot of times people can't separate being critical and also enjoyment. I can say, this was still bad, but I still enjoyed it, and I still think it could be worth the play for a lot of people. Unfortunately, Warner Brothers Montreal also won't be able to follow up with some other story DLC or a sequel because of the bad reviews. As soon as those reviews came in, honestly, its sales were probably low, and there was just no reason for them to keep developing like a DLC. I know they obviously have done some Heroic Assault DLC, but if they, let's say, we're going to add like a Two-Face mission DLC, it'd probably end up costing them way too much, and a lot of people probably wouldn't buy the DLC. So no reason for them to waste money, or especially on a sequel. So it kind of sucks. But as always, I would love to hear your comments down in the comment section below. Drop a like if you did enjoy the video, and check out some of my long form reviews for other games if you do enjoy gaming in general. And as always, I will see you next time.